go. And we are going to get rolling here. So again, love to have a little interaction with you. I find that interaction from my attendees really fuels my energy and it builds the way I teach. So the more you interact, the more juice you're going to get out of me. Just saying, just saying. Now, here's one thing we know about eye anatomy. It's not sexy, right? It's not one of those things that usually people go, pick me, I want to learn eye anatomy. The interesting thing though is if you don't know eye anatomy and if you don't know it well, you can't do iridology very well. We need to understand how the eye is put together and we need to understand how that impacts what we are seeing and it helps us to understand how to interpret things a little bit as well. All right, are you ready to maybe look at some eyes with me? For those of you who are on Instagram, I'm going to pop my camera around and we will move the camera closer to the computer screen as we need to help you see better what we are doing. All righty. So again, I'm just going to ask you to please interact with me, make comments, ask questions. Let's make sure we are having a conversation here, not just a monologue. Monologues are not a whole lot of fun. What we know first off when we're talking about eye anatomy is that eye photos that are done properly for iridology are taken very, very close up. And because they are taken very close up, we often lose these distinctive markers. And, you know, the markers I'm talking about are we lose this inner canthus area and we don't see the nose and we don't see the outer canthus. So we can't really ascertain from a lot of eye photos which eye we are looking at. So let's do a quick little helper here so that you can tell when you're looking at photos which one is which. The first thing we need to know is the pupil is never directly in the center of the iris. So as we look at this eye, we see that this side is narrower. This side of the iris is narrower than this side. The narrow side names the eye. So if the narrow side is to the right of the pupil, did I say the iris is never in the center? I meant the pupil. Hold my feet to the fire here. So good to see you. Thank you for joining us on Instagram. Ooh, seeing lots of people pop onto Instagram with us. Whoops, nice to see. Thank you so much. And so what we've got here is the pupil is never dead center. It's always off center and it is always closer to the, okay, yeah, tangling my words, off center, and the narrow side names the iris. There we go. That's what we needed to talk about. And so as we see that, if the narrow side is to the right of the pupil, then it is a right iris. If the narrow side is to the left of the pupil, it is a left iris. Now that is really, really important because, as you know, each eye shows us information that is relative or relevant for that side of the body. So the right eye is the right side of the body. The left eye is the left side of the body. And while we like to think we're symmetrical internally, we're not. You've got more liver on the right side, more heart, more spleen, more pancreas on the left side. So we need to know what if we're looking at a right eye or a left eye. Very, very important. As we look at an eyeball, we need to understand how this eyeball is actually put together. And when we look at this, we need to remember that the eye is actually the largest neural receptor in the body. The optic nerve is a direct connection to the brain, and it's one nerve. It's not a series of nerves, it's one nerve. And the receptor end of that optic nerve is actually the eyeball. And so this is the largest receptor in the body, the largest neural receptor. When we look at the eye in a cross section like this, we've got two chambers that are filled with fluid. We've got the anterior chamber, and this has aqueous humor. We've got the posterior chamber, and this is filled with vitreous humor. And that fluid helps the eyeball to hold its shape and to actually have some flexibility as well, because your eye changes shape in order for you to be able to focus on different objects, right? It's the eyeball changing shape that allows the image that is coming in through the lens to focus as sharply as possible on the retina. When we look at the eye, we need to also remember that these two chambers, the anterior chamber and the posterior chamber, are separated from one another by the lens and the iris, but primarily the lens, because this right here is the pupil, and the pupil has a hole, is a hole, right? The pupil is just a hole. It's a hole. And so if the lens wasn't here, these chambers would be pretty much running one into another. The lens is held into place by the ciliary muscle, and that's what we need to know there. Again, the pupil. I am having a tough time with my words today. The pupil is an opening. The pupil is an opening. Is that what I said earlier? Oh my goodness, the pupil is an opening. The lens isn't an opening. The lens is an organ or a tissue on its own, but the pupil is an opening. The eyeball itself is encased in a very tough membrane, and that tough membrane, for the most part, is white. This is called the sclera. But at the very front, the sclera becomes clear, and this clear part is called the cornea. Okay, and this is important because the cornea has to be clear, or we wouldn't be able to have images shine through it or reflect through it and invert through the lens and show up on the retina for us to actually be able to see. The optic nerve, again, exits the back of the eyeball, and it splits into two nerve pathways. And this is an important little point because those two nerve pathways do interesting things in your brain. And I'm just going to flip my phone camera around one more time. Hello. And what happens here is that we've got two nerve pathways coming out of each eye. And one of those pathways stays on the same side of your brain, but the other one crosses over. And where these two cross is called the optic chiasm. It is this crossing over and having the straight ones as well that actually gives us 3D vision. If we didn't have that dual neural pathway, one going straight and one crossing over, we would not be able to have depth of field in what we see. And then the fact that our eyes are both on the front of our head adds to that as well. So when we see these nerve pathways again, this just gives us more understanding about how our vision actually works. So let's look at a cross section of the eyeball. I'm doing this because it's going to lead into the next image we're going to look at. We've got the iris right here. Can you see this thin pinkish bit right here? And notice this stuff in here. This is going to be important later on, possibly too. We're going to focus on this area right here in our next diagram. This diagram is that exact thing we were looking at in that previous image. This is that little pink thing. So we've got the pupil right here, and then we've got one side of an iris here. So this is a cutaway cross-section thing. Alrighty, so as we're looking at this is the anterior border layer. So this is the front-facing side of the iris. This is the side that you see when you look at someone and you smile and you say what beautiful blue eyes you have. This is the anterior border layer. Now this anterior border layer is behind the cornea. So we've got the cornea up here, okay? And when we have this cornea and we've got the fluid and then we've got the iris, and we've got the anterior border layer of the iris. This anterior border layer is where the pigment is held. So if you're looking at someone who's got blue eyes, they have very little pigment in their eyes. If you're looking at someone who has hazel eyes, they've got more pigment. If you're looking at someone who's got brown eyes, they have the most pigment, and the darker brown you're looking at, the more pigment is there. Now, this is important because if we've got the pigment being held just behind this layer right in here, it's going to mask or cover everything that is happening in the body of the iris. And happening is an active word. I shouldn't say it that way. It's going to mask everything else that we could see in the body of the iris. Okay, so the body of the iris in here is called the stroma. This is the bulk of the tissue that makes up the iris, and it contains trabeculae, which are individual fibers. We're going to talk about those in a minute, and blood vessels and nerves and muscles. And the muscles are really, really important here. We also have this posterior membrane. Now, the posterior membrane is made up of exactly 2 layers of cells that are very, very dark brown or black. And I remember in junior high school having to do a dissection of a cow eye. And I distinctly remember thinking, isn't that interesting that the back side of the front part of the eye is black? I had no idea what it meant. I'd never heard of iridology back then. My goodness, this was before this was when the earth was young and grass was green, right? Almost when dinosaurs ruled the earth. And, but I had no idea, and I didn't even think to ask. I just thought, oh, that's interesting. I was not a very curious student, I guess. These black cells wrap around this inner edge of the iris so that they create a bit of a frame edge, if you will, to where the pupil is. Now, this posterior epithelium, that's what these layers are called, the posterior epithelium, again, is black. Now, when we look just inside the posterior epithelium, we're going to see some muscle fibers here. This is sometimes called the posterior membrane, or more correctly, it's called the dilator muscle. So this is the muscle that is responsible for opening up the pupil. That's going to be really important at, when we finally get into really deep information, like when you're in the iridology course. This is the sphincter muscle. And the sphincter muscle goes around that sort of the inner edge of the iris, and it is responsible for constricting the pupil to let less light in. Alrighty, so we've got the anterior border layer, and that is the layer that holds the pigment. And you now know that the least amount of pigment is seen in blue eyes, the most is seen in dark brown. And we know that that pigment can obscure what we see in the body of the iris. I'm going to look at an example of that in just a moment. We've got the posterior epithelium, which is always 2 layers thick, and it's black or very, very dark brown. We have the dilator muscle, we have the sphincter muscle, and we have various other blood vessels and things like that in this tissue as well. So now when we're looking at this, and again, this is that cross section we just looked at. And so if that is this piece of the iris, right, going, say, straight out at about 9 o'clock in each of these, you can see that in the blue iris, we have very little pigment. So we can actually see these fibers. These fibers, again, are called trabeculae. And we can see less of the fibers in this eye because there's more pigment, and we can see even less of the fibers in this eye because there is even more pigment. Now over here, oops, there we go. That was weird. My Instagram just paused me, which was not fun. Over here, when we look at this little area where it stair steps down, when we see separations in the fiber, we see shading in the eye. The darker the shading, the deeper the separation goes. And this is an inherent thing. This isn't going to change. It's always going to be there. So looking at this eye, we can see we have some shading here, So we know that here we've got some fiber separation. This becomes significant when we do an iris analysis. When we look at this eye, we can see that we have areas that are quite black. So these are areas of very significant fiber separation going very, very deep. We have an eye like this where we have some fiber separation in some areas, again, that's quite black. So when we look at this diagram and it says that white means we've got an area that's prone to being inflamed and overactive. But as we get darker and go deeper, it tells us that this area is less reactive. It's less resilient. It doesn't take nutrients in as well as we'd like it to. It can't get rid of garbage as well as we'd like it to. And so we need to be aware of that, because then we know that these shaded areas may, depending on the person's health and what they're doing for their well-being already, may need some support. But we need to ask questions. We need to understand our client more than just looking at an eye photo. Now, for those of you on Instagram, I apologize. This keeps pausing the Instagram video, which is a little annoying, but thank you for hanging with me and for putting up with the frustrations of technology. When we look at this image, can you all see that in this image there is a white milky film in the top of the eye? Oh, Beta 7916, you made it. Good to see you. So glad to see you on Instagram. So when we see this milky white film, can you all see this? If you can see this, give me a thumbs up or let me know in the comments box. Can you see that? This is an unusual marker in that it's not true iridology. Okay. When we talk about doing iridology, we're looking at the iris, but this white marking is in the cornea. Now, you will hear me say over and over again when you hang out with me long enough that what we see in the eyes is inherent. It's what your parents blessed you with. It is genetic. It is 3, 4, maybe even up to 5 generations of information passed down to you. And so that tells us a little bit about your parents, your grandparents, your great-grandparents, and how they were put together. When we see this white ring, this is not necessarily genetic. It may have genetic influences, but this is not in the iris. It is actually in the cornea. And it has, so it's in that top outermost layer of the eye. Thank you, Deshawn, for letting me know you can see this. Thank you so much. This tells us, gives us information about liver function and about how the body is managing carbohydrates and lipids. Okay, now do you remember in here, I said that these would be important in a moment. Well, they are going to be important in just a moment. We'll get to the slide. Here we go. So when we look at an iris, we've got the entire eyeball here, and here we've got the iris, and here we've got the pupil. We talked about the sphincter muscle, and we looked at the dilator muscle in that cross section. As we look at it here, this is a really important point to remember, because these are the 2 specific sets of muscles in the iris that control how much light gets into the eye. The more light we have, the more sharply things focus, because the smaller the pupil is. And so when we look at the sphincter ring, it is a muscle that goes around and around and around. So what does that mean? It is, again, because it's a sphincter, its job is to contract things, to close things off. So what that means is that it goes like this, and when it's been activated, it's going to do this, and those fibers that interlock like this, as they interlock further, it contracts the muscle and the pupil gets smaller. So that's all fine and dandy. We can make the pupil smaller, right? And that's a good thing when it's really bright out. But what if we need it to get larger? Well, in that case, the dilator muscle anchors in at the edge of the pupillary muscle, of the sphincter muscle. And it also anchors in to the sclera. And what that means is that when this dilator muscle, whose fibers also interlock, when it ratchets and it's doing this and getting smaller, shorter rather, it means that this distance is going to get shorter, and it's going to pull on this edge of the sphincter muscle. As it pulls on this edge of the sphincter muscle, that is going to then take that sphincter muscle that was like this, and it's going to pull those fibers apart to widen out the pupil. Does that make sense? Did that work for you? That is how these muscles work together to control light going into the eye. So again, the dilator muscles radiate out longitudinally, and these are all controlled by the sympathetic and nervous, this is controlled by the sympathetic nervous system, where the sphincter muscle is under the control of the parasympathetic nervous system. So the parasympathetic nervous system says, I'm coming back to normal, I'm relaxing. So when the pupil is small-ish, it usually means the person is more relaxed or they've got bright light. The dilator muscle is under sympathetic influence, which means when you're under stress, this is going to activate. It's going to open up your pupil. It's going to dilate your pupil so that you've got better peripheral vision, so you can see if there's a bear chasing you. Okay. And so that is how those muscles work. Now, the interesting thing here is that we know that the iris has some 28,000 nerve endings in it, but we don't know what they all do yet. Isn't that fascinating? So in this picture, we can often see that the constrictor muscle really clearly. When you look at this eye and we start at this inner edge, can you see that right here, the tissue changes? And right here, it's like there's an edge. Got an edge in there. That edge is actually showing us where the constrictor muscle is. Right? And so this is the edge of the constrictor muscle. When we are looking at an eye and we see all these fibers, and again, you're not going to see these fibers in a dark brown eye because there's so much pigment in that anterior border layer that it hides, it fogs over, it masks all of the fibers. But when we see the fibers in a blue eye or potentially in a what we call a biliary eye, which is that eye that's not really blue and it's not really brown, those fibers are actually capillaries. And hello farmhouse, good to see you. When we see these capillaries, the capillaries come from the edge or the limbus of the iris, come in as arterial flow, do a hairpin turn, and go back out as venous flow. Now, if these are capillaries, why are they not pink or red? Because capillaries carry blood, and that usually means that we've got red in there, right? Well, the capillaries that we now call trabeculae, because they're in the iris, are not red or pink because they are coated with collagen. They have a collagen sheath on them that, that takes that color away. It hides the pink or the red. Inside, in the inner edge, now I just want to flip back one image here to show you where the dividing line is. So do you see in this picture, we've got this one interesting fiber that is wrapping all the way around like this? Okay. When you see that, that is the comparison to this ring that is coming around. So all of the fibers out here, starting at the edge, start at the limbus, come in towards the ring, do a hairpin turn, and go back out. And again, it's arterial flow coming towards, and it's venous flow going away from. When we are inside this ring coming around here, the flow goes from the inner edge to that ring and back to the edge again. And again, if anything going from the edge towards this ring is arterial flow, anything moving away from that ring is venous flow. All right. And so when we are looking at this, we just want to understand that, and we want to understand that these are coated with collagen, because sometimes we see times when the collagen has eroded or the collagen was never there. Just like in MS, the myelin sheath disintegrates. That happens with these as well. And when we see this, it gives us clues as to other imbalances that are possibly active in the body right now, and certainly imbalances that we need to be asking questions about. So when we look at iridology, and particularly when we're looking at constitutional iridology, we are studying color. We are studying where the colors are sitting in the iris and how they are sitting. We are studying the fiber structure when we can see it. And it's really important for us to remember that as constitutional iridologists, we don't play the party game. We don't play what I call crystal ball iridology. We don't look at an eye and say, oh, you've got this problem and this problem and this problem and this problem. I mean, you've got a problem here and a problem here and a problem here and a problem here, because we don't know that. These are all things that have been passed down through the last several generations. The fact is, they may cause problems for this individual if this individual chooses to lead a lifestyle that would allow those problems to surface. Or this client may, by doing really good things for themselves, health-wise, may actually be able to circumvent those problems ever manifesting. So we need a conversation. Let's do a little iris analysis using this eye. Would that be okay with you? You want to see a little analysis here? Okay, normally we would want both eyes, but I only have room on my screen for one. And I apologize that we've got all kinds of reflections and things showing up on the computer screen, but that's life. This is a female client in her mid-30s. She came to me with fertility challenges. She'd been trying to get pregnant with her husband for the last couple of years, and they conceived once and then had a miscarriage. So when we look at her eye, remember we talked about how darker means less reactive, less able to take nutrients in and give garbage back. We can see that she's got lots of different layers, lots of different depth fields to her eyes. Hello, Rafun, good to see you. And so when we look at this, it just shows us that we've got layers of trabeculae there. And some of these fibers, like this one in particular, I'm going to show you the blown up picture. This one actually looks like it's laid right on top of the surface of the eye, which it often does, particularly in a brown eye. Now, this eye does suggest that there may be actually a potential that this person might have what we call the MTHFR defect. Now, the MTHFR defect is something that can really mess up a woman's chance of getting pregnant or a man's chance of fathering a child, because it has a lot to do with how they handle their folate. And if they don't handle their folate well, it can impact their fertility. So with this kind of a client, we would also then look at the eye, and we recognize from here that there is the possibility that there are also some liver challenges inherently. So we want to ask questions about that and recognize that the MTHFR defect is actually an enzyme deficiency in the liver, a particular enzyme. And so knowing that, we may want to do some liver support. We may want to do some things that would support her in the event that she has MTHFR. We see that she's got, and I don't know if these will show up really well. Oh, they'll show up over here. Do you see these rings coming around here, these little wrinkles in her eye? These wrinkles tell us that she probably burns through her B vitamins, vitamin C, and calcium and magnesium very quickly. So we need to talk about her diet, make sure she's getting adequate of those and maybe supplement them. Do you also see how there's that little bit of cloudiness starting to build in the over the outer edge of her eye? You can see a little bit here as well. We've got a bit of cloudiness starting to build. This is like that heavy white ring we saw a few slides ago, right? So we know that her liver, right now, dynamically, currently, this is something that's going on in her body, and it's not going to reverse in her eyes themselves. But we know that her liver doesn't manage its carbohydrates well, and that can really mess up the lipid profile, which again can have an impact on fertility and a whole bunch of other things. So we needed to ask her about her carbohydrate cravings. And she actually said that, yeah, she craved carbs really bad, but she had started cleaning that up and she had done a beautiful job. She had been eating carbs to an excess. And when she cut that out about 6 months before we met, she lost 12 pounds, like within a matter of 3 months, just because she was not eating the refined sugars. Now, it's really important for us to remember that we don't ever want to talk about every single marking. Every single marking is not important to our client at this moment. Bombarding them with that much information is not going to help anybody achieve anything. It simply is going to overwhelm them. So we want to make sure that when we look at their eyes, we understand what is their current concern. And then we look at the eyes to understand, why is that concern happening? Is there a genetic reason for it to be happening? Or is this something that our client has just simply inflicted on themselves by their lifestyle? Does that make sense? Does that make sense? So we always want to have that conversation. We never want to just create a long list of, I see this and this and this and this and this, and you've got this problem, this problem, this problem, this, because we don't know that they've got those problems. These show us inherent tendencies, not inherent guarantees. Okay. All right. So as we continue on, I want to just invite you to join me for an info session to teach you more about constitutional iridology and about the upcoming class that starts in January. That is a course that will prepare you for certification with the International Iridology Practitioners Association, if you so choose. Now, here are a few details about the class. The course itself is the only live, online, fully mentored course for nutritionists, herbalists, and naturopaths who want to streamline their clinical work without sacrificing client care. Because what I see is that holistic practitioners they give a lot of time away. They see the client and then they go off on their own and they spend 2 or 3 or 4 hours creating a protocol for that client, and they don't get paid for that time that they're creating the protocols. They bring the program back, they give it to the client, and often it is way more information than the client needs right now. And it overwhelms the client. So the client doesn't follow through. And that means the client usually doesn't come back for another appointment. That's not good for anybody. The client doesn't progress. And you're constantly having to find new clients because the clients are being scared away. So the purpose of this class is to teach iridology, constitutional iridology, to help you integrate what you already know about herbology, nutrition, whatever modalities you use, into your iris assessment to help you create your client programs right when you are with your client, in that hour or hour and a half that you are with your client. And that will ensure that your programs are simple enough to get results, simple enough for your clients to stick with and to feel successful, so that they will want to come back to find out what do they need to do next. This info webinar is being held on Thursday, January 7th at 5 p.m. And you can hop on over to iridology.education/webinar to get on the list to be able to register for it. And again, this is a free webinar. We're going to talk a lot about business, to give you some business building tips, as well as look at how iridology can help you to get control of your business, get control of the hours you spend for your clients, and actually probably free up a lot of time to either see more clients or have a life or, spend time with your family, all those kinds of good things. So I invite you to make a note of that and to hop on over there, iridology.education/webinar, and get registered for that so that you can join me to learn more about the course itself. Again, iridology.education/webinar. All righty. Now I have seen absolutely no questions come in. I've had lots of waves from Instagram, and I so appreciate those. Thank you so much. And I look forward to seeing you next Wednesday for another little mini info training session like we've done today. And I look forward to seeing you on January 7th as I share with you more information about the program. Take good care, and I will see you then. Bye for now.